Gideon discovers his new identity, believes his new identity, is purified by the Lord, steps out in trust and faith in the mission that the Lord has given him, and the Israelites are forever different. Welcome to the Spirit-Filled Leadership Podcast. I'm Pete Barak. Miguel's behind the mic and the camera. We are ready to go. Today's topic actually doesn't have really very much of a title. I'm just going to tell the story of Gideon because I've been reading Judges, which is kind of a fun thing to do. There's some pretty interesting stories in there. But I've been reading Judges because I was drawn to this one line from the Gideon story that I haven't been able to stop thinking about and praying about. And I just spent a week at Pine Hills Boys Camp with about 200 young men seeking the Lord. And I told the story of Gideon throughout the entire week. And it's just been something that's just been sitting on my heart, and I wanted to share it with all of you. So how this fits into us as Spirit-filled leaders, well, I think Gideon's a Spirit-filled leader in his own way, and there's some lessons from the Gideon story that I think we can pull out for our time and place today. So here's Gideon. Gideon is an Israelite, a Jewish man, in a time when, like so many of the stories of Judges, it starts with, and the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of God. And so right out of the chute, Gideon is living in a time where the people of God, the chosen people, have forgotten who they are. They have rejected the promises of God. They've rejected the worship of God, and they've started to do their own thing. And as we see in the Old Testament, whenever the people of God say no to God, reject him, reject his promises, reject his decrees, live by their own standards, it just doesn't go well. And so in this particular case, there is a group, a tribe, a country, the Midianites, who are basically laying waste to Israel whenever they want. And so what the Midianites have been doing is they let the Israelites grow their crops long enough and full enough to then come steal them all, burn the rest of them, kill, pillage, do their thing. And the Israelites have no protection, they have no army, they have no identity, and they have no hope. And it all comes from the fact that they've forgotten who they are. They're the chosen people. God has promised to take care of them, to protect them, to walk with them, to sustain them. And instead of living in those promises, the Israelites have rejected that and are worshiping false gods. So when we begin the story of Gideon, we find him, and quite frankly, Gideon is not brave at the beginning of the story. He's not a hero. We find Gideon at the beginning threshing his grain in the wine cellar, in the place indoors, basically. And what that means is he knows that if he threshes his grain out in the open, where you should, because there's so many scraps and the dust is huge, that if you do it indoors, it's cloudy, it's hot. He'd be inhaling all sorts of junk as he's threshing his grain. But he's doing it indoors because he's afraid of the Midianites. He knows that if he does it outside, they're going to see, and a band will come by and steal all his grain. So he's fearful, he's afraid of them, and he's doing this task in a kind of the worst, least efficient way to do it, out of fear. But while he's doing that, an angel of the Lord appears to him. And this is the line that set me on this path of trying to be like, what can Gideon teach us? The angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and declares something about him that at that moment is objectively not true. But it's true because God sees deeper than our actions. He sees the core of our identity and proclaims something about who we really are. The angel of the Lord looks at Gideon and addresses him as a mighty man of valor, a strong man of courage, which when you look at him at that moment is just wrong. He's hiding. He's scared. He doesn't actually know who he is. He's not out in the open with his true identity as a mighty man of valor. He is a scared man of cowardice, trying to try to protect his grain and trying to keep himself safe. But the angel of the Lord, on behalf of God, looks at Gideon and proclaims the truth about who he really is. He looks at Gideon and says, "You are a mighty man of valor." And then goes on to tell him that the Lord has chosen this mighty man of valor to free his people, to set them on a new course of freedom, of wholeness, and restoration from the division that they have with God. Gideon is going to lead the people both in terms of physical freedom and then spiritual redemption. And we'll just stop right there. This is just foundational to the life of a Spirit-filled leader, is to take the time to hear from the Lord. Who are you, really? What is the deepest identity of a disciple? What is the deepest identity? What does God actually say about us? And we'll do a whole episode at some point about how we identify some of the lies in our life and renounce them and step away from them. But fundamentally, we are who God says we are. We're not our actions. We're not our thoughts. We're not our hopes. We're not our dreams. Fundamentally, our identity, for those of us who are baptized, is to be a son or a daughter of God, as Romans 8 tells us. That those of you who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. That fundamentally, you are part of God's family. You are a beloved son or daughter of the King. That's really who you are. And everything else can build off of that. Your mission, your actions, your behavior, your dreams, your hopes, your leadership, all of that has to be built off of that core understanding and knowledge and belief of who God says you are. But like Gideon, most of us may hear that and kind of go, okay, yeah, maybe I know that, maybe I don't, And Gideon even hears mighty man of valor and hears what he's supposed to do next, and he's still fearful. He's still concerned. He has questions. He doesn't understand how it's going to work, but he starts to hear the voice of God through the angel, and he starts to believe. And he starts to take a step of belief. And the first step that Gideon takes to confirm his new identity is not to go out and raise an army. It's not to, do anything really publicly dramatic. The first step of Gideon living in his new identity as a mighty man of valor is to worship. He goes out and he prepares a sacrifice. And what's interesting is the sacrifices that the Israelites have been making to these pagan gods are unclean, impure, sinful sacrifices. And so the first step of redemption is to have a mighty man of valor start to believe his identity and offer a new sacrifice to the Lord, and one that's genuinely to the Lord. And so Gideon takes his sacrifice, his burnt offering, if you will, and brings it to the Lord, and the Lord reaches out and touches the sacrifice, and it bursts into flame, and it is burned up. And it's a symbol that it's an acceptable sacrifice to the Lord, because the fire of God's love receives our very offering to him, and he purifies us, and he empowers us now to do the next thing. This, you could say, is a type or an analogy of what the Holy Spirit does in us. We start to live in our new identity through baptism, and then through confirmation, the fire of God comes and confirms in us and purifies us and inspires us and drives us to the next step. Our identity is confirmed. We offer ourselves as a living sacrifice to the Lord, a living sacrifice that he deems acceptable, that he purifies with the fire of his love. And now we're ready for the first step of the mission. And so Gideon knows his identity, offers himself as a sacrifice that the Lord determines is acceptable. And then right after that, he realizes, okay, I just offered an acceptable sacrifice. Now I need to tear down the idols that my family and my people have been worshiping instead. And so, not totally brave yet, under the cover of darkness, he goes out and he tears down the big idol to Baal. And he tears it down, and the people of the town wake up the next morning and they're infuriated and they want to kill him, and his father stands in the gap and intercedes on his behalf, and then they realize this is a mighty man of valor who's doing something, who knows his identity, the Lord has determined is acceptable. And what we start to see is the people's minds start to change about where they should go, because one man, and then another man stands beside him, his father, but one man starts to live in his identity as a mighty man of valor, offers himself as a worthy sacrifice to God, who the Lord blesses and empowers through his fire, starts to tear down the things through the power of God that are unacceptable to the Lord, to pagan worship. So the question for any spirit-filled leader is, as we live in our identity, as we're filled with the power of the Holy Spirit, to ask the question, Lord, where are the idols in my life? What am I sacrificing to that is not you? What am I worshiping that is not you? Where have I blasphemed by putting common and ordinary things above you, which is supernatural and extraordinary?
Could you give any examples?
Yeah.
In your own life about that?
Yeah, so some examples would be my pleasure, my own time is often an idol for me, where I'm just like, oh man, I will protect my time and my leisure and my fun above anything else. Money is another big one, right? Where we glorify money. We always need more money. We covet more money. We wish we had more money if we don't have enough. And we are often very generous in some areas and less generous in other areas. So there's a couple of pleasure, money, reputation is another one where I've often felt like, oh man, the most important thing is to be able to be seen and acknowledged as who I want to be. And so anything that would threaten my reputation or would somebody not like me or kind of the peer pressure of being accepted by certain people can often become an idol, right? And it's not necessarily like, those are not holy things to worship. Those are common and ordinary things. My pleasure, my money, and my reputation those are common and ordinary. They're not extraordinary and supernatural like the Lord is, right? So we have in Gideon living in his new identity, believing his identity as a man of valor, worshiping the Lord, tearing down the idols, but he's still struggling with trust because the Lord has given them this huge mission, which is to free his people from the Midianites, but he's still struggling. And then you have this great scene in Judges where Gideon does this whole fleece dance with the Lord. He says, all right, Lord, I will believe that you're calling me if I put this fleece out. And at night, the fleece, the ground around the fleece will be soaking wet, but the fleece will not. The dew will fall on the ground, but not on the fleece. And in the morning, the fleece is dry and the ground is wet. And he's like, great, awesome. But let's do it one more time. This time, flip it. The fleece is going to be soaking wet and the ground around it's going to be dry. And then I'll know that you are, that you're behind this call. And what's so interesting about this is, you could look at that and say, isn't Gideon like testing God? And in a certain sense he is, but there's something about his purity of heart and his desire to know the Lord and do the Lord's will and live in his identity that I think the Lord recognizes in this, where he's, instead of Lord being frustrated with him or impatient or kind of like, how dare you? I've already called you. Look at what I've already done in your life. The Lord just meets him where he's at. And he says, the mission that I have for you is so important, and the call that I have on your life is so significant, and the desire I have for intimacy with you is so profound that the Lord's kind of like, all right, if this is what you need, I'm willing to meet you here. And it's a fine line, because I think sometimes we do this thing with the Lord where we say, Lord, I'll believe you if you do these things. And I think that's a lot of times not an actual genuine kind of question to the Lord. I think a lot of times that's more of us, just our flesh crying out, our lack of faith. And I think the reading of Gideon is he has so much faith and he has so much desire to follow the Lord's will, and he's living in his identity that he only wants to do what God wants him to do, so much so that he's like, I need more concrete discernment, if you will, concrete evidence, concrete movement of God, so that I can be assured in my own heart that the faith that I have is driving me to the proper place. Okay, so you have identity, worship, tearing down idols, learning to trust, and then finally action. Gideon takes action. And I'm not going to spoil the rest of it, because I actually want you to go read it. Go read Judges 6, the whole story of Gideon and looking for these beats. But ultimately it culminates with a pretty amazing victory that the Lord does. And the Lord creates the environment for the victory through Gideon so that it's very clear who brought the victory. And I think this is an awesome lesson for us as Spirit-filled leaders, that as we live in our identity, as we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice, as we tear down the idols, as we learn to trust the Lord, that we should be eager and open and looking for opportunities to move and act as the Lord leads us, but doing so in such a way that clearly gives him glory. That at the end of the day, we can point to him being like, wow, look at what God did. Because at the end of the day, Gideon's still the one wielding the sword in the battle. But because of the circumstances and the things that the Lord asked him to do, it's also very clear that there's no way the victory could have been won without the Lord. And I think about this when I, again, bringing it back to camp. Here we have Pine Hills Camp. We had, again, 200 guys there. And I think about all the work that went into it from a lot of different people. But we would all, to a man, go like, yeah, but God moved. Like, camp is camp because of Jesus and because of what Jesus does. And yeah, we cooperate in his mission, and we're able to give of our own time, talent, and treasure to make it happen. And we're willing and able to act. And I think to some degree we're living in our identity, and we're trying to offer ourselves as a worship sacrifice to the Lord. And we're trying to tear down the walls and the idols in our heart, and we're trying to trust him, and we're acting. But at the end of the day, the miracle that is camp. And I mean that seriously, like in terms of to be able to pull off and to see the impact in the fruit, the tangible spiritual fruit and practical fruit for that matter, of where the boys are at the beginning of the week to where they are at the end of the week. It's just so obviously a movement of God. Like it's just so obviously something beyond what any of us could possibly do ourselves. And that brings such glory and honor to the Lord when we can acknowledge that and recognize that. And it's so wonderful to be able to lead in such a way where we leave so much space for the Spirit to strip away things that don't need to be there, to add things that we didn't even consider, to inspire new ideas and new insights, and to just let Him lead. Any Spirit-filled leader needs to know and believe and be convicted about that you are led by the Spirit. Which it seems so obvious, a Spirit-filled leader. But a lot of times the angle we've been taking on this podcast is more like, how do I lead? And how does the Spirit inspire me to lead? And yet at the end of the day, what we see in Gideon is as he inspires us to lead, the leader continues to ask the Lord, where are you going? What's your opinion? What do I need to strip away? What do I need to add so that at the end of the day, even as you're working through me, I'm still following and being obedient to you? So, Gideon, Judges 6, check him out. Become and believe that you are a mighty man or woman of valor, that you have a core identity that the Lord speaks into you, that the Lord confirms in you, that the Lord has established in you, that the response to that is worship and a tearing down of idols, that even as we learn to trust Him, He meets us where we're at and walks with us, and then asks us to take action. And go read Judges 6 and see how Gideon takes action. And, yeah, if you think about it, let me know what you think. All right. Spirit-Filled Leadership Podcast. I'm Pete Barak. We love that you've joined us, and we love for this little growing community of Spirit-Filled leaders. Check out our Intentional Disciples ID YouTube channel. We're doing a lot there with shorts and other little clips that I think will be inspiring to you. Nearly every day we're posting something to just a little nugget of inspiration, a little nugget of fun even, to help you grow as a disciple and as a Spirit-Filled leader. So this has been fun. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Peace.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Come, take my hand. We'll dance on grace.